Okay, welcome back to part two of the Economic Anthropology screencast for Anthropology and World Problems being offered at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania. So we had talked last time about Marcel Mauss's work, The Gift, and looking at the exchange and how every single gift requires a return gift. And how basically in Malinowski's work on the Trobrians, with the exchange of bracelets and arm shells would go one direction and then the other. And one would have to continually move their prestige goods along these lines. And along with the prestige exchange, there was also the exchange of gimwali, or goods of immediate subsistence value, including food, because of the different resources on the islands and what they were able to procure. So the prestige, as well as the other material goods, flowed in this way. Now, if someone was hanging on to one of these prestige objects for a year, more than a year or two, they would be looked at by their trading partners as a hard man. So they would not gather or garner the respect that they would by otherwise continuing to circulate the object. And again, this becomes a basis for a lot of other ethnographic work and indeed work in marketing and exchange as well, and thinking about the giving of a gift and how that necessitates some sort of social obligation or marker. Other examples here, Daniel Herman's Gift or Commodity, What Changes Hands in the U.S. Garage Sale, talks about what's actually going on is both a gift and a commodity. Garage sales, particularly pre-pandemic, right, with the cost of goods being sold there was, maybe as low as 10% of what the new value of the good would be. But what was going on there is that people wanted to know that their good that they were selling to somebody else was going into the proper hands. So as an example, I bought this TV that was picture-in-picture, very old school type of technology, probably weighed about 60 pounds or something like this. But it was pretty cool, I guess, for what I had. And I remember getting it, and the guy who was selling it to me, he actually hauled it over, for me as he was moving out of town. And he looked at it one last time, and he's just said, I'm glad that it's going to a home that's really going to appreciate it, right? And so it was the idea that not only was he selling the TV, and I think he was asking $50, and then I was like, well, how about 25? And he's like, okay. But he knew I would enjoy it, and so that meant something to him. And this is what Herman's talking about. She gives some examples of sweaters and how people will see the sweaters they've sold to someone else walking around town, or stories that are exchanged in the garage sale. Herman, I believe, gives an example of Van Gogh's Starry Night, and they talk about this particular painting and its implications and its meanings, and the person ultimately sells it for even a smaller portion than what they're asking for. Lee Johnson notes of gift giving and reciprocity amongst Japanese Americans of Honolulu. So this idea that exchange continues to occur, and indeed we see this in many different contexts today in terms of reciprocity and exchange. In the Pacific overall, I work in the Federated States of Micronesia as part of my research work, and yeah, there's certainly a lot of ideas of gift exchange and reciprocity there. We also see examples from Alaska, Molly Lee's work on the cooler exchange, like a little cooler that you would store drinks, beverages in for picnics in summertime. But these would be used to bring fish and other subsistence foods back from rural areas into Anchorage And Lee talks about how Flora Mark, which is the person that she's following, this is a pseudonym, will basically bring donuts with her as she goes to these different communities. And so there's this exchange that is occurring. Petra Bethman looks at Koryak women in the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. Russia's far north, and notes that women will weave for men, will sew skins that men produce. And so this is looked at as a way to essentially get marriage partners. And so a woman would indicate her liking of man by sewing skins. And of course, man would be in the gender distribution of labor would historically have been the hunter and gone out and procured these skins. So in this way, they both demonstrate their worth to one another as good marriage partners. Consumption, again, I talked about this example of Starbucks before, but the using up of material goods necessary for survival. So Malinowski and basic human needs. Principally, people are driven by basic needs, nourishment, reproduction, health. A society may be threatened if needs are not being met. And this is why institutions were formed in order to guarantee basic human needs, food-getting techniques, training, shelter, and kinship. It's also why we see with food security issues, and we'll talk about this later in the semester, when we have things like global food crises, what that means at the national level. If the government cannot supply its citizens with food, this leads to political instability in the region overall. So there's this idea that government exists for the goodwill of the people, and if it's not doing that thing, that of course is incredibly destabilizing. The external explanation, this idea of cultural ecology, we'll cover this later in the section on population with Manners following Stewart's work, Julian Stewart's work. But the idea that resources of a particular habitat and humans' adaptation to the local ecology are what drive particular consumption patterns. So basically what you have next to you. And the cultural patterning of construction. Humans construct their own niches by way of tools, social relations, domestic crops, agroecologies, and therefore construct their own patterns of consumption. And of course, this is a way of viewing the landscape overall. You could look at a space as, oh, that's an agricultural field, or that's a national park. And what is consumed in those type of spaces, or what can potentially be consumed, is based on these social and cultural relations. Some examples. Early on in the first of the two screencasts, I talked about this idea of the insatiable desire for more, this idea of accumulating more and more and more. In cross-culturally, that's not necessarily the case. And Marshall Solins addresses this in his 1972 work on the original affluent society. And this is basically the Zen road to prosperity, that people would feel richer and be richer by desiring less. So there wasn't this constant need to consume. There wasn't this idea of scarcity. And so Solins, during this time period, there were time allocation studies that were utilized by anthropologists and other social science researchers. And they found that if you think about, and you could also think about this today in terms of what your working hours are, and how those potentially extend, past an 8-hour day or a 40-hour work week with salaried individuals, or you can think about, as a student, all of the obligations that you potentially have to have in terms of going to in-person classes, doing the materials and other assignments at home for online classes, distance education classes, and in-person classes. The commutes, food preparation, care of the self, so grooming behaviors that we read about and we learned about in Horace Miner's look at American cultural practices around the body. Laundry, all of these types of things that you need to do. And if you think about all of those things, what is your actual amount of work that you do in a week? So some really interesting questions here about it, in terms of discussions about things like mental health and well-being, work-life balance. I think Marshall Solins really touches on some key aspects here that we can see cross-culturally that help to inform that. Julie Guthman's work looks at colorblindness and universalism in California alternative food institutions, particularly around in the context of farmers markets, wherein white college-age women are typically the ones that are selling the produce at these farmers markets, and it's typically middle-aged Latino men that are growing, and Latino women, Latinas that are Latinx that are growing the food in the fields. So most of the farm workers, what you see at the market isn't necessarily who's producing it. And this is, again, what we see in the nice shiny display in terms of our technology and our phones and all of these things. We don't see Owe Ong's discussion of semiconductor factory workers. Bilestock and Whitman's piece, Literacy Campaigns and Indigenization of Modernity, Rearticulations of Capitalism, looks at how people can consume resources from a variety of social and cultural contexts, some of which relate and some of which are embedded in a new cultural context, as Miller talks about with Coca-Cola in Trinidad. There's also an interesting discussion around in the global context about things like intellectual property rights, authenticity, and what counts as authentic. So there's this nice piece from Lavenda and Schultz's textbook looking at Steiner's description of exchange between an African art trader and a European tourist that centers around this idea of authenticity. So the tourist is concerned with the authenticity of the mask. How old was it? Has it been worn? Is it a real mask? And the trader wanted to know if what was being exchanged, the Seiko watch, was a copy or was an original Seiko. We also can think about how issues of sustainability are wrapped up in market-based approaches to sustainability, as well as how global capitalism and resource extraction can cause impacts both ecologically and in terms of rights of individuals, indigenous rights, human rights issues, and social equality issues across the board. So if we're looking at global environmental discourse and indigenous rights, we've got a number of pieces. Kodak's work in international development showed us that culture can play a big role in terms of economic development, and that the cultural component of projects can lead to better overall outcomes. Crutch's work in Reflections on Conservation, Sustainability, and Environmentalism in Indigenous North America looks at the impacts of Native peoples throughout Native North America historically and in the contemporary moment. And of course, this is also a matter of scale of the disruptions. Ghosh's work on Between Global Flows and Local Dams, Indigenousness, Locality, and the Transnational State in Jharkhand, India, looks at this idea of the Adivasi and how these people are assumed to only be able to survive based on subsistence. So this becomes a way to disrupt the building of large transnational dam projects. It is one of the few examples of a successful resistance to the development project in a large-scale hydroelectric plant. Kirsch's work on indigenous movements and risks of counter-globalization, tracking a campaign against Papua New Guinea's OK Tani mine, looks at the situation in the context of international environmental organizations and how these disrupt what locals actually want in terms of retribution for the contamination of the land. Finally, Martin Medina's work on scavengers provides the book provides an analysis of scavenging and looks at a number of myths around scavenging. And of course, scavenging is messy because it disrupts this idea of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption, because you have a product that has already been discarded. But that product isn't necessarily of little to no value and actually results in quite a bit of economic impact for individuals participating in scavenging activities. So as a brief synopsis, we have covered economic anthropology and its relation to economics. We have considered the various aspects of economics and ethnographic examples of those from a variety of cultural contexts, looking at production, distribution and exchange, and consumption.